welcome to the webinar hosted by the Citizens Archive of Pakistan on Mapping Stories of South Asia, a conversation exploring transnational representation through filmmaking. My name is Tayyebi, and I am a researcher and a digital archivist. I have been recording oral histories, and as an organization that is dedicated to the preservation of culture and uses storytelling as a medium for doing so, it's a pleasure to be here. I have a fantastic panel with me, including Sparsh, Jawad, Navtej, and Dr. Eleanor. And I'm going to introduce everybody and then get this conversation rolling. First, we have Sparsh Ahuja, who is a co-founder of Project Dastaan. He's a multimedia producer and National Geographic Explorer. And his films have premiered at the Sundance and the BFI, amongst others. He's based between Delhi and Melbourne. And Sparsh has South Asian roots himself and migrated to Sydney to Australia at a young age and explored his own identity through storytelling. He was introduced to Mr. Khalid Bashir as part of his oral histories, and he was fortunate enough to go back to India to capture Mr. Bashir's village, brought it back with him, and by the use of virtual reality, actually connected both the storyteller and the origin of the story. And on that note, I'd like to go to Sparsh to ask more about what he does, and especially this particular story, and also talk about his upcoming projects. Sparsh, over to you.
Hey, so thanks so much for having me. Yeah, my name is Sparsh. I started alongside two friends an organization called Project Dastaan in 2019. We interview people who survived the partition, and if they want to see their ancestral homes, we create virtual reality experiences for them so they can revisit these places. Over the past 2-3 years, we've filmed around 15 of these stories. As you can imagine, it's quite a long process. We interview the survivor wherever they are today, and then we send a team out to their ancestral home across the border. We bring the edit and VR experience back to them, and through these stories, we've created one VR experience called Child of Empire, which is playing in Karachi at the moment, and will be coming to Delhi next month to the Partition Museum, which puts you inside the shoes of these survivors' journeys in like an animated documentary. And we've also made 3 short films called Lost Migrations alongside animation studios in both India and Pakistan, which explore some of the lesser told stories of partition, like the stories of women or the stories of the Tamil diaspora that was in Southeast Asia, or the stories of people whose lives were torn apart by bureaucracy, like some of the army officers during the partition. So yeah, we're kind of storytelling based on these 3 themes of identity, belonging, history, religion, what all these concepts mean. So I'm really excited to be here today and share some of this work. So we're in Karachi at the moment with the Citizens Archive, which is really exciting.
So Sparsh, maybe you could tell us a little about the first story that you collected and the first time you were able to connect the storyteller to the origin of the story and how that experience went.
Yeah, so the first story that we were able to track fully was of a gentleman called Khalid Bashir Rai, who is now in London. He's Pakistani. He was born in India, in Punjab. So we had come across his story because one of my co-founders, Sadia from Lahore, her friend's grandfather. And it was super emotional because, you know, we were all college students. We had this idea of recreating these journeys, but we had not put it into practice. So to see that this village still existed, that he still remembered the dargah, he still remembered the village like farms, the roads, it was really emotional for him, and he felt like he'd been reconnected to his childhood. So yeah, it was very special for us. It took us maybe 1.5 years to plan from when we interviewed him to when we got the story in front of him. So then we went back to London to show him the experience. So are you sharing a video of that? I think we do have a small video.
We do have
Yeah.
a small video. Let's get into the video and then come back and talk more about the storytelling experience, and also how storytelling is such a powerful tool in itself for connecting with the humanity of history.
Everybody was very upset. You see, because you're living, if you rent a room here, you don't want to leave it. And you were living there for centuries. All you people were buried there and all, you love the place you live.
We still miss that our brothers who had migrated to Pakistan.
You turn, you can see more.
Oh!
Oh! You can turn absolutely around. Look like this.
कमाल हो गई बेटा, आपने ये मेरा बचपन याद करा दिया। एक एक जगह अब तो नहीं, वो जगह नहीं पहचानता हूँ, सब बदल आ गई तो, लेकिन वो मस्जिद पहचानता हूँ।
बट जो पुरानी मस्जिद थी वो आपको याद है?
याद है। अच्छा तो
No, it is an emotional experience अपने बचपन में देखना। हम आपके लिए एक तो there was this video that we went and did. These are pictures.
So yeah, as we can see, Sparsh, this was a really emotional experience for Mr. Khalid, and it must have been the same for all of you documenting it. What I'd really like to understand is, why do you think it is so important to document these stories? And more than that, why is it so important to make sure that we find innovative ways of sharing these stories with the world?
I think, look, we started off just because it was so important for the witnesses themselves to be able to make that journey back, despite all the travel restrictions. And so, to be honest, when we began recording these stories, we didn't think it would be something that people outside these families would resonate with, or that it would get the attention that it had. And it was really as an act of service to give back to our grandparents who had made this journey, because often they came with nothing. But as we've recorded more and more of these stories, what we've realized is that this generation that survived partition or this kind of cataclysmic event are able to, if not through what they say in the interviews, but just their life stories tend to not neatly fit into the boxes of national history that have been created in either India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. And so by looking at these stories of people who have been saved by members of the opposite religion, people who have sheltered members of the opposite religion, people who kept the keys to their old house thinking that they would go back, or all of these stories that don't really fit into our history books, we become to realize that, maybe these lines that we've drawn and seem so clear and firm now, it seems so black and white, and it seems like it was always this way. Maybe those haven't always been the case. And that's not to undermine any national or to the power, self-determination, or idea of like patriotism. Look at historical circumstances outside of these lenses as well, and maybe we'll learn something from that. So that's why I think it's important to preserve these stories.
For sure, because One of the most important things that I've felt as an oral historian is that history isn't as black and white or as straightforward as our history books would like us to believe. There are many nuances and there are many clusters which are often forgotten. And one of the most important things that is forgotten in history is the human element, the experiences, the personal journeys. And I completely agree. It is by thinking outside the box and personalizing these narratives that we're able to tap into a part of it that we can all resonate with. So thank you so much for that. And on that note, I'd like to move to our other partners for the conversation. I'd like to talk about Navtej, who's a professor in political sociology, and Dr. Eleanor, who's a senior lecturer in history at the SOAS University of London. Navtej has done research across the India-Pakistan border in Punjab and has published on vernacular popular religion, which connects societies across the borders. Eleanor has researched and published on how the end of the British rule affected family law and citizenship practices in the subcontinent. Both Navtej and Eleanor are leading on an Arts and Humanities Research Council project called Border Crossings, exploring community and history through virtual reality at the 75th anniversary of the partition. So Navtej and Eleanor using virtual reality in and using virtual reality as a means to connect with history, and that also in an academic world. How did that come about? And can you tell us more about Border Crossings? It seems extremely interesting.
Okay, thank you, Alia, for the introduction. So our project, Border Crossings, has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council UK, and it's more or less a follow-on to previous research, some of the research I've done, which was predominantly in India and Pakistan, across the border between India and Pakistan, but looking and trying to use the concept of border crossings, not necessarily literally, but also thinking about it in terms of the multiple ways and multiple logics through which borders actually operate and persist and are sustained through language, through discourses, through the ways in which narratives are told. And it relates to storytelling in many ways in terms of how those histories have been passed on. And as you were just mentioning, Alia, how history is oftentimes taught, how it's written, how we're told to think about belonging, national belonging in particular, and other ways of belonging, the us and then them, the ways in which oppositional notions of particularly around partition, how and why it happened, those understandings. I think we find that at the 75th anniversary, and this has been a real opportunity for us to work with Project Dastaan. This project comes out of this partnership with and collaboration with Project Dastaan, with Sparsh and his collaborators as partners. So we are using virtual reality in many ways as a prompt to have new kinds of conversations about how partition has been understood, how it's been commemorated 75 years after 1947.
So Navtej, what I would really like to understand is you've been using virtual storytelling, like you said, for some of the projects that have come up recently, but traditionally we were never looking at a virtual reality or recreations or personal narratives even to look at historical facts, if we were to say so. What do you think created this change, created this space for this kind of conversations to take place to begin with, and why do you think these conversations matter?
I mean, in many ways, it's no wonder that at this juncture, and it's 75 years is quite a long time, and in other ways, it's not very long. But what we see, and if those people who've been kind of studying partition studies is an area of study and a discipline in its own right now, and the shifts from nationalist kind of understandings of the partition, those kinds of framings, how it's taught in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, also in the UK, very importantly. And then we see people who've gone through those educational systems, people who have also migrated in 47 and other points as well in the region. Then we've got migrations globally So different kinds of questions are being asked now. And so it's no wonder technologies, of course, evolved. So I think there's a convergence there going on around movement, ideas that are also circulating. They're kind of cross-fertilizing, and they're also interacting and utilizing technologies to have these new kinds of conversations. It's not saying that it's necessarily, challenging everything that's been said before, but it provides a different kind of lens rather than having to access that single textbook that you're handed in a physical form and it's taught through that curriculum. We see that people are accessing information from lots of different places now. The internet, of course, is the most obvious example, but even people to people sharing of stories and connecting, the possibilities there for actually having these new kinds of conversations is I think it's certainly opened up that space. We see it in the diaspora, and we also see it through the technologies, and especially through the virtual reality and the experience that Project Dastaan have created.
So definitely, and I completely agree with you. I think it is through parallel storytelling and parallel documentation of history that we might be able to create a more holistic angle of history in itself, because if we look at traditional historical documentation, it's a very singular lens, often high politics, and that completely eradicates the human element of it. And I think if we want history not just to be a document and actually a learning curve, then we have to put in the human angle, otherwise it'd be a lost cause. Eleanor, you work with family law and citizenship practices. And I would love to understand how, using these kind of research-specific lenses, are we looking at virtual reality? Do you think there is a way of translation of these practices? Because again, citizenship law and family law, and using that to understand South Asia is very complicated, because there are many nuances within these. So if you could tell us more about that.
Sure. Well, I think my involvement with this project has come about less directly from my specific research and more about teaching these subjects in a UK university with a very diverse student community, and about how South Asia is framed as an object in the university space, in text space, and then in a student diaspora space, particularly where you have students who have connections to the region, and often different connections to the region. So we have students studying from Pakistan, from India, but also British South Asians who have different kinds of connections back to the region. And there's an assumption that comes to be made that this region is a fixed object that everybody looks at in the same way. And so it's really the experience of teaching subjects that have made me more interested in kind of reception and conversations around that. And just to go back to the Borders Crossing project, I mean, that's what we're interested in too, and also in archiving those differences. I mean, I think that's one of the things that the research we're doing is trying to do. So we're not creating stories like Sparsh or like Jawad, but we are looking at what stories do. So this thing also about sort of how the way that we look at the past is changing. I think that's also about the questions we ask from the present. And so what we've been doing together in the project, and we have got some slides that just give you a sense of the work that we're doing. We've been following the virtual reality, and we've been asking people who've seen that to complete a survey and to sit and talk with us about how they've received that story, the perceptions they brought to it, and how the VR is prompting them to think differently about histories of partition. And from those conversations, we've then gone on to organise a series of interviews, sometimes with individuals, about their personal connection to this story of 47 and its legacies, but also intergenerational conversations with family members too. And what we're trying to capture or to recognise is that at this crucial juncture of 75 years, there's a growing public awareness, particularly in the UK, with this history, but that doesn't mean that there's a single monolithic account of that history. And even within the same family, how people look at that past can change. So we're seeking to kind of understand those multiple conversations, but also thinking about how then do you document that and archive that? How do you keep this plurality of voices and experiences? And to give you one example of, I mean, we're playing, we're trying to be as creative as possible with the project. But when we originally launched it, we set up an immersive room where Sparsh and his team ran the virtual reality, ran the animated shorts. People came and they had this kind of out-of-body experience that you get with the virtual reality. Sparsh said, you're put into the shoes of somebody else. And it's a 360-degree world. But you do that wearing a headset, you're on your own. I mean, you're very aware of your body as you're taken out of it. And we paired that with a second event in the evening that we called the Multiverse Mushaira. So whereas you had the kind of metaverse of VR, we took a multiverse using a mushaira, the focus on assembly, the focus on conversation. We invited performers from across the region and the diaspora. We had rap, we had spoken word, we had traditional Bengali folk music. We got people talking to each other throughout the night. And so we went from this deeply immersive experience with the headset to another immersive experience of talking and being and listening to a lot of different voices, so that people could put those together and sort of using that sort of complicate understandings that we have of partition and sort of where we think that history lies and what we see its legacies to be.
No, I mean, I can completely relate to the story of virtual reality and being in someone else's shoes, because for one of the things that we did as part of the Citizens Archive was create Pakistan's first National History Museum, which was basically also about virtual reality. And we put people inside a booth of a track where we made them experience partition as people were crossing the borders in train, and it completely changed the perception. So now coming to your slides, if you could tell us what we're watching.
Sure. So these are photographs taken of the Child of Empire tour of the UK, and Tej come into the too. I mean, but you already see some of the different spaces that you have here. One is Bradford Cathedral, the other is Derby Museum. Very different communities of people coming to the VR. There's a few more slides showing other spaces where it was shown. So I mean, I think thinking about the internal experience of seeing the VR, but also the space in which people are going through this experience is of interest to us. If you could move to the next slide, please. This is the BFI, again in London, a very different audience circulating. You can see here on the left, somebody completing the survey that we've made to go with the experience that actually asks people to categorize partition using terms that they think, and then sort of pushes them to complicate those categories. So even the survey is something of a conversation with the people who are completing it. And if you could move to the next slide, please. I think we have another. This is our SOAS student body. It came to SOAS for 2 months. And the next slide, please. Sorry, this is V&A. In fact, there's one more slide. And then, so this is one of the interactive workshops we've run with students from the region and from the diaspora, taking terms and asking people what they think of them, getting people to explain how differently they see some of these key concepts that we link to the region. So from South Asia, minority, majority, Desi identity. And then the last slide, please, gives you a sense of our Mushaira event. So we had performers, we had an audience in a university auditorium. We had a lot of food and a lot of conversation, and we've been trying to capture that conversation through feedback forms. We used a Mentimeter live interactive response system. So we're interested in archiving responses to the kinds of powerful stories that Sparsh and his team are collecting.
So thank you for that, Eleanor. And border crossing literally feels like an experience rather than a course, which is something that is really, really important for us to understand, because I think the way we have been traditionally looking at academics and the acquiring of knowledge, I think that's also changing with the changing world around us. And I think it's a fantastic way of immersing ourselves into someone's reality of the past and trying to make sense of it according to our sensibilities, but looking at it through their lens. So thank you for that. So the next person on our panel today is Jawad Sharif. Jawad Sharif is an award-winning filmmaker whose work focuses on the interface between the dominant culture and the real impact on people, society, and the environment. Jawad is a TED Fellow and an alumnus of the UCLA Swedish Institute and the Institute of Germany. He is also the Festival Director of Asia Peace Film Festival and a jury member of the Jaipur Library Academy Awards, India. His feature film, Indus Blues, has won the Grand Jury Prize at GIFF and has been nominated in several other international film festivals, including CPH-DOX Copenhagen. His other feature films include K2 and The Invisible Footmen, The Color of Smog, Natari, and The Losing Slide. So Jawad, thank you for being with us. It's lovely to have you. Tell us about your interest in filmmaking. How do you see filmmaking and culture coming together? And tell us about your films.
Thank you so much. And I already feel so inspired by the Sparsh work and by the presentation of Eleanor and Navtej. I mean, this is so inspiring, and it is pushing me to continue my work, you know. So thank you so much. So basically, I mean, I feel like I have like very strong connection with the culture, and specifically when it comes to our indigenous cultures and the whole partition thing, you know. So I was raised by my grandmother, and she migrated from Indian Punjab. So I used to listen a lot of stories like during my childhood, and it was all about, you know, partition. It was about like how was life there, how we used to live together in peace. And it is like those are like kind of fairy tales, you know, and it always inspired me to, I mean, to connect with it somehow. So Indus Blues, I mean, my film about music and culture, that was the journey to, it was, I mean, it was more about, you know, kind of search, like, let's find those artists, those musicians, and those cultural values. I mean, why they are fading out, why I can listen those stories just from my grandmother, why I can't see around me, you know. So I couldn't observe them anymore. I couldn't hear those stories. I couldn't see those people. So it was like it was a search to find those people, you know, who are still connected to, I mean, their roots, and I mean, their traditional values and their rituals, and that, I mean, that was it. And I mean, I still feel like I mean, it's a very spiritual journey for me, and it still goes on. I would request if you could show the trailer of Indus Blues. So, I mean, for the participants, so we can, I mean,
Definitely.
जब 1, 2 दिन 3 दिन का बच्चा हो गया, पैदा हो गया, तो उसको फिर किसी सांप का जहर होता है, उसका आधे कतरे का उसको जो सुती पिलाते हैं।
मौलवी टाइप लोग तो कहते हैं वैसे ही गलत है, ये हराम है।
1-2 दिन उसी जहर के नशे में बच्चा सोया पड़ा रहेगा, तो दूध भी नहीं पिएगा अपनी अम्मी का।
इंसान की उम्र गुजर जाए ना, फिर भी साज नहीं सीख सकता।
फिर हुए बच्चा बच गया तो हम जोगियों का होएगा, बड़ा संपेरा बनेगा, और मर गया तो फिर अल्लाह का।
death happening in the musicians' folk world, in the dancers' folk world.
अपनी आने वाली नस्लों को सिर्फ किताबों में दिखाएंगे कि ये सरंगी होती थी और ये आखिरी सरंगी नमाज था हमारे मुल्क का।
जब मेहर और मोहब्बत खत्म होता है तो क्या मौसीकी के एहसास है?
एक दिन में 3 दिन दमा दी। द्रो द्रो
पूरा मुल्क खराब हुआ हुआ है मजहब और सियासत के चक्कर में।
मजहब के नाम पुजारी थे, हम प्यार के भूखे प्यासे थे, हम सच्चे थे जब हम कुत्ते थे।
रक्स भरा हुआ है, मेलोडी भरी हुई है, क्योंकि यहाँ के सिस्टम, मजहब, रीतें, रस्में उसे रोक रही हैं।
2 मिनट
हमारे मुल्क के आखिरी सरिंदा प्लेयर रह गए। अब इनको भी अगर हमने डॉक्यूमेंट नहीं किया तो हम ज्यादती करेंगे अपनी सकाफत के साथ।
नहीं ये
वही लेकिन आपकी सकाफत देर तक नहीं।
Thank you. I'm sorry, Alia, the trailer was playing and I couldn't hear you.
Oh, no, I couldn't hear the trailer. I think today's not been a good tech day for us.
Yeah,
I
you were saying
apologize.
something. No worries,
No,
no worries.
I was just saying that I remember having watched the film and I watched it multiple times. And every time I watched it, every sound that I heard as we changed course with the Indus was a sound that I carried within myself. And I'm sure a lot of people who have watched and who will watch will feel the same. So tell me what you were thinking when you were going on this journey and what you started off and how you changed as you moved on.
Yeah, actually, as I said earlier, I mean, this project was like very close to my heart. I mean, this was like very personal. And when we were on this journey, for me, I mean, I developed like very personal connection with those artists. And, you know, and most of the time you hear stories like, for example, if you have seen the trailer, so there is a snake charmer, wo jo basically jo hai wo and he's telling a story like jab jo hai Pakistan or India, when Pakistan and India is separated, so some of the artists, some of the snake charmers, I mean, they left in India, and some of them like they left in Pakistan, you know, and now we and since then we are trying to connect, but we couldn't connect. So for me, it was more about, you know, connecting those dots. I mean, to connect with those people, and it was so similar. We have got a lot of feedback from across border, and it was all about like it's same. I mean, we experience, I mean, same music, same people, culture, colors, everything. I mean here, so this was so similar. But what happened? I think since last 75 years, I mean, it's a big time, as Eleanor was, I mean, she mentioned. So the narratives are, I mean, evolving. The narratives has been changed. And what happened, for example, like we have very few sarangi players in Pakistan. I think we can count on fingers, maybe like 2, 3. That's it, you know. And when I was filming Zohaib in Lahore, like the old Gharana of Sarangi, and I mean, and I have seen that tragedy in his eyes. I mean, no one is going to continue this, you know. And I was sitting at his home, and we were having like a batak, like a mehfil, and he started showing me videos from India, like from Sarangi players from India, and he said, like, look at these videos. These are small kids, and all of them, like, they are playing Sarangi, they are learning Sarangi, and what is happening here, you know? So the whole narratives, I mean, that whole narrative shift, this is so tragic, and it is happening in the moment. And unfortunately, in Pakistan, I feel like we are going through, specifically my generation or the Gen Z. So I mean, I feel like we are going through this crisis, that identity crisis, you know. We don't know where we belong, you know, and then there is this confusion between religion and culture, you know. So generally, I mean, so it has been fueled, I mean, in our minds, like that culture is linked with the religion, and it comes from the religion, you know. And I keep thinking, like, what I hear from my grandmother, those stories, but there were no deserts, there were no camels. So so this is something, you know, different. So this identity crisis, I mean, it is, I feel like it's very tragic. And I try to capture, I mean, through my films, like, it's more about, I mean, the political angle of history as well, but it's more emotional angle of history. It's more about, like, the, you know, the fading cultures, the fading artists, the fading traditions, and that is very emotional. I mean, if you are going to lose something, and you are just going to experience it through virtual reality, thanks to Sparsh, or through films, or I mean, through pictures, I mean, it feels so painful at times. And I don't know, like, in our artist capacity, or as a researchers, or as a scholars, I think we are trying to preserve, like, at some extent. Yes.
For sure. So I completely agree with you, Jawad. As a archivist myself, I have been constantly feeling this urge that if I don't document, a lot of our history will be lost, because of many frictions and many conflicts that are existing within our societies at different you know, clusters as we're moving forward. And it is really important to understand that every cycle within it has many different angles that should be brought together, especially if you want to, again, coming back to the same principle, that if you want to look at societies from a larger lens. So Sparsh, coming back to you, I would love to understand that as a South Asian who grew up in the West, did you ever feel connected or disconnected with your own cultural identity? And you know, because you were living in two cultures at the same time, and how did you make your peace with that? And has the project that you've been doing helped you in some way, and you think that others like you would be able to, you know, maybe look at something like that to understand themselves?
Yeah, I think yeah, I think definitely this project was a way for me to reconnect with my own family's history. I don't think I ever lost touch with, like, the South Asian side of myself or the Indian part of me, because my parents were, I mean, they almost were really kind of tightened down on that when they moved overseas, and almost like to form a sense of community. So they defined themselves by that identity, and there was another us-them dynamic already created in Australia, where we had to protect our roots and our language and our culture at all costs. And that kind of reactionary, like, mentality is almost what got me thinking about my grandfather's story and how he migrated, and then how our identity became defined as this like opposition to them and to Islam and all of these things, because my family ended up getting involved with BJP politics later down the line. So looking at those generational shifts and how we chose to define ourselves really prompted me to look at my grandfather's story for sure. But it was also, he also asked to see his old home again. So those, you know, it wasn't just about a process of self-discovery. I think it's happening now a lot more, that people who like South Asians who grow up in the West are asking these questions like, who am I? Where am I from? What does it mean to be Indian or Pakistani or Desi? And I think it's really interesting to ask that question, but I don't think people go far enough and then say, okay, now I know, what do I do next? We get caught in this kind of navel-gazing exercise of like trying to just define our identities, but like you got to move forward from that and create. And that creation isn't necessarily just about sticking it to the white man, because I think a lot of the art ends up going in that direction of like, look at me, I'm proud of who I am, I found who I am. That has its place, but I think you can create stuff for yourself after you find out who you are. And that's why I wanted to go back and look at my grandfather's story, as opposed to, you know, writing about a coming age story of someone growing up in a white school or, you know, anything like that, because I don't know, I think that discourse has had its place. And I think like as a community, if I speak for South Asian diaspora, I think we need to like almost look past that and maybe like borrow leaf from what the Black community has done, and they're making art for themselves now. It's not about opposition to a social structure or like an imagined hierarchy of acceptance. It's about us for us. And I think that's the next step in that discourse of finding. If you've done that process of self-discovery, you're not comparing yourself to kind of like the community you're in, whether that's, you know, like post-partition, or whether that's like my family who moved to Australia. So after you found that, what comes next? Do you kind of keep asking those same questions, or do you move forward? And so that's this project was about, and looking at kind of repairing some of those wounds by giving these participants a sense of the journey back, the reconnection. And I hope that like my community is able to do the same for themselves in Australia soon as well. Let's see.
Lovely. So I have a question for all of you, and anyone can jump in to answer. What I've been noticing, and it's a pattern, that by the start of the new millennium, there was a conversation that was taking place, at least I can say that very confidently for Southeast Asia, was the impact of post-colonization. There were more memory projects that were coming up, and people were actually questioning history in its totality. And for a large amount of time, I had almost felt as if partition itself was romanticized to the point that it felt like some sort of this massive exodus that had taken place, and there was this idea of post-colonization as this sort of independence and the start of a new era per se. And then we realized that it is not that simple. And it's by going and understanding these stories that we found that there's a lot of loss, there's a lot of displacement, there's a lot of trauma. And most of this trauma had never been addressed. I remember one of the things that I started actively understanding was that partition has never been discussed as a wound that needs to heal. It has never been discussed as a scar. It has never been discussed as a loss. It has just been almost, like I said, romanticized. So I would love to know what you guys feel about that. And Navtej, we can start with you, and then maybe I can take that question around for everyone.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in some ways, the partition has been with us all. There are, I mean, in many ways, we look at it as history, but we also look at, as Eleanor was saying, it's about very much about the present. We actually are living in the aftermath of it. We are living in the afterlives of it. We use the terminologies that we inherited, majoritarianism, the idea of minorities, the ways in which there's violence exerted against minorities, the ways communities get labeled, the way that the state also encourages those labels, the us and the them, militarization. There's so many different processes, and I think Jawad's film was already alluding to that, you know, in such a beautiful visual way. But I think this is what we have inherited. And the fact that we are able to now, and I think that is something significant about the 75th anniversary, is that we saw the oral histories, we've seen the gathering of, you know, these voices, because that generation were dying. And all due respect to our elders and the older generations, but they did not pass on a good world for us. And I think this generation now, and I'm going to say younger generation, so Sparsh and his colleagues and others who are here too, are the ones who are going to shift that narrative, who are actually pushing things. I mean, I have crossed the border many, many times. I was very fortunate to be able to do cross-border work from the mid-90s, early mid-90s and onwards. And I lived on both sides of the border. So, and we'll say both sides. I actually don't even oftentimes recognize the border. I speak Punjabi in a way which is spoken across. My family came from Jarawala, near Faisalabad. And they migrated, and then immediately went to the diaspora. I'm born and raised in the US and have lived in the UK for 30 years. I've traveled where do I belong? Someone asked me that question. Where are you from? Do I say I'm from that village in East Punjab where we migrated for about 12 years? Or actually in the bigger history, the bigger picture, which isn't just about my individual story, where do I fit into this world? I think these are kinds of questions that we are asking now. I think we could say many of us have had enough of accepting the kind of hegemonic knowledge. The storytelling does serve a really important role there, but we've been hearing stories which were loaded with very xenophobic, communal, sectarian, very inflammatory kinds of ideas, which also much of which stems back to the partition. So in some ways, it's a reframing of the partition in ways that gives it the humanity that allows us to reconnect. We do reconnect in the diaspora, you know, whether it is, you know, New York or London or Sydney or different places, pockets, Yuba City, where we actually live in mixed communities. One person came out of the VR at SOAS, who was from the community, an older person. And they said, they like, remember their words exactly, they said, Lagta jaise partition hua nahi, because they had come and there were other people there. They could see visibly there were people from what would be seen as the other side of the border. The diaspora, we're mixed. We go to school together. We live in mixed communities. So the idea of that partition, of that border is liminal. It's also metaphorical, it's symbolic, but it's constantly being crossed just by even thinking. So border crossings for us is a way of thinking. It's not just about getting a visa. It's not just about having that permission to cross. It's actually thinking differently and actually thinking across those lines of distinction that have been so firmly placed in our books, in the stories, in how we view ourselves, how we represent ourselves, and how we view others. So yeah, so a long answer to that question is how, and it's a bit of hope actually as well. It's a bit of hope that we are actually having these conversations now.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And thank you for the long question. I really enjoyed it. Long answer. I agree with you on principle for many things, because that's what I've also understood, that our generation was very confused about what the truth was, what we had. It almost felt as post-colonization, we did not know where to address our grievances. So we just clubbed it and shoved it. And now suddenly we've opened the genie and we want to have these conversations, often most of which are very, very difficult. And but I do believe that these conversations must be had if we are to move forward. And this is just one of the ways in which we can have these conversations. Creatives are, I think, always way ahead of time in itself. They're telling us about the change that is coming in the most beautiful way, in the most poetic way possible. So yeah, for sure. Eleanor, if I could take the same question to you. And
was just a few words that kind of inspired by Tej and Sparsh. I mean, I think that we've had oral history, there's been incredibly important oral history work done around partition for 22 years now. As you say, that kind of millennia was the kind of the hallmark. But I think we've also learned through that those oral histories can open up questions, can open up new ways of thinking and seeing, and they can shut them down. They can reaffirm national borders and sort of xenophobic stereotypes. And I think we're now at that point, Sparsh, as you say, what do we want this history to do? Where is the future that we want to go to? I mean, Tej speaks, of hope and of kind of building the world that we want to see going forward. And I think that's a responsibility, that is a responsibility that creators have taken up, but it is also a responsibility for historians and for archivists. History is a very powerful tool. Narrating has a politics. It can shut things down as well as open things up. And I think, how do we want to build a history that can open up new futures and speak to a much broader range of experiences?
So I love the fact that history that opens up new futures. I mean, for me, that would be my closing note. So thank you for giving me that. I completely agree. I feel that it's not just about having these conversations, but also realizing what these conversations will feed into. And I remember one of the most important elements of being an oral historian, especially with the partition generation, has been what I call my aha moment. I would go and I would speak to people about their experiences of partition, and most of them would tell me these stories that I oftentimes felt as if they had been retelling to themselves, but not to other people. And it would be through a singular lens of this happened to us, and this was happening, and this is what happened. And then I would just take a moment and ask them to reflect on what was happening to the others. Was it just them that this was happening to, or was it across the board? Was it happening to others? And then I have often seen that moment in their eyes when they've really taken a hit back and been like, oh my God, it was happening around us, not just to us. And for me, that has been that thought of healing that I talk about when I speak of partition. And I know we're running really out of time. So on that note, and using Eleanor's last words, of history that feeds into a future, I'm going to thank each and every one of you for being a part of our conversation today. And thank you, Sparsh, Navtej, Eleanor, and Jawad for being such wonderful audiences. And thank you, everyone. And I wish you all a safe night here from Pakistan and hope to connect soon.